A woman in the coal hills of West Virginia could not close her hands in the morning. Every day, the same thing. She would wake before dawn, swing her legs off the bed and sit there, just sit there, waiting for her fingers to remember how to move. The stiffness had crept in slowly, the way winter creeps into an old house. First the knuckles, then the wrists, then the knees, then the shoulders, until getting out of bed became a negotiation between her body and her will. She had no money for anything. No car, no neighbors close enough to walk to. Just a kitchen, a wood stove, and a jar of bones she kept on the back porch in the cold. Every morning she boiled those bones. Chicken feet, beef knuckles. Whatever the butcher threw away, she drank a cup of that broth before eating anything else. Dark, rich, almost gelatinous when it cooled. Within 3 weeks, she said her hands opened easier. Within 2 months, she was hanging laundry again. Her daughter told that story 60 years later, still shaking her head. Mama never saw a doctor in her life. She just drank that broth. That broth, number 3 on this list, is the one that almost nobody remembers how to make properly anymore. And the one at number 7 used a part of the animal that most butchers today throw straight into the garbage. These are 10 bone broths from the hardest years, the ones that women made when the cold settled into the body and would not leave, when the joints ached so deep it felt like the bones themselves were tired. Nobody called them remedies. Nobody wrote them in books. They just made them every morning and kept moving. Let us begin. Number 10. The chicken back and neck broth. Nobody bought chicken backs and necks on purpose. They came attached to the whole chicken, and the whole chicken was all most families could afford, when they could afford it at all. After Sunday dinner, the back, the neck, the spine, and every scrap of cartilage that nobody wanted to eat went straight into a pot of cold water. You did not start with boiling water. That was the first rule, and it mattered. Cold water, bones in, then a slow climb to a simmer. An onion cut in half, unpeeled. A carrot broken by hand. A stalk of celery if the garden had one. Then you walked away. 3 hours. Sometimes 4. You came back when the kitchen smelled like the walls themselves had absorbed something warm and deep. The broth that came out of that pot was golden, almost amber, with a thin layer of fat floating on top that grandmothers never skimmed. That fat was not waste. It was warmth you could drink. In a kitchen without heat, in a body that had not been warm since October. That layer of fat was the difference between shivering through the morning and standing up straight. Church women in Appalachian communities would deliver this in mason jars to anyone they knew was struggling through winter. No conversation, no fuss, just a jar on the porch and a knock on the door. If your joints were stiff and your body was cold from the inside out, the answer was always the same. Drink the broth first, eat the food after. Number 9, pork knuckle broth. The butcher counter had a hierarchy. At the top were the cuts with names, the chops, the loins, the roasts. At the bottom, in a pile that most customers walked past without a second glance, were the knuckles, the joints, the pieces that were mostly bone and cartilage and sinew with barely any meat clinging to them. That is exactly what made them valuable to anyone who understood what a slow simmered bone could do. Pork knuckles went into a deep pot with bay leaves, peppercorns, and cold water. 6 hours on the lowest possible flame. Not a boil, never a boil. A boil made the broth cloudy and bitter. A simmer, patient and unhurried, coaxed everything out gently. By the end, the liquid had turned silky, almost thick enough to coat a spoon, and when it cooled in the icebox overnight, it set into a jelly that trembled when you touched it. That jelly was the sign. Grandmothers knew it without anyone explaining. If the broth set into jelly, it had given up everything the bones had to offer. If it stayed thin and watery, the simmer was too short, or the heat was too high. Farm families in the Midwest kept a rotation. Chicken bones early in the week, pork knuckles on Wednesday, and whatever beef scraps the butcher had on Friday. The broth changed, but the ritual did not. A warm cup every morning before the body was asked to do anything else. The first kindness of the day was not breakfast. It was the broth. Number 8. Beef marrow bone broth. There is a moment about 4 hours into a proper beef bone simmer when the marrow inside the bones begins to dissolve. You cannot see it happen, but you can smell it, a richness that is deeper than meat, deeper than fat, something almost mineral like the earth itself releasing a secret it had been keeping. Butchers in the 1930s practically gave marrow bones away. They were too heavy, too awkward, too much work for most customers. But the women who knew, the ones who had learned from their own mothers during even harder times, would ask for them specifically. "Give me the big ones," but they would say. "The ones with the marrow still in." The preparation was almost ceremonial. You roasted the bones first in a hot oven until they turned dark and the marrow started to bubble. Then into the pot with cold water, a splash of vinegar. Not for flavor, but because the acid pulled more out of the bones than water alone could. Then the long wait. 8 hours. Sometimes overnight on the lowest flame the stove could hold. The kind of flame you had to check was still alive. What came out of that pot the next morning was not broth in the way most people think of broth. It was concentrated, dense, dark amber. And when you drank it, you could feel it land in your stomach like something solid. Like it had weight. Like it was filling in cracks you did not know were there. A retired railroad man said he drank this every winter morning for 30 years. He said his body never felt the cold the way other men's did. He did not know why. He just knew the broth worked. And he kept making it because his wife had made it, and her mother before her, and stopping felt like losing them all over again. Here is something worth understanding before we go further. We're not recipes in the modern sense. Nobody measured anything. Nobody set a timer. Nobody followed steps from a book. They were instincts passed down the way you pass down the sound of someone's voice. Not through writing, but through repetition so constant that it became part of who you were. The generation that made these understood something about bones that modern kitchens have forgotten entirely. They understood that the parts of the animal closest to the joint, the knuckles, the feet, the connective tissue, the cartilage, held something the muscle meat did not. Something that released only with time and patience. Something that made a broth thick and rich and nourishing in a way that no amount of seasoning or technique could fake. They did not have a name for it. They did not need one. They just knew that when the body ached and the cold had settled deep into the bones, the answer was always the same. Not a pill. Not a visit to anyone. A pot on the stove. Bones and water. Time. If that sounds too simple to work, consider this. They lived through winters that would break most of us. They worked with their hands every single day. And they kept moving. That is not a small thing. That is everything. If this is reaching you at the right time, if your body has been telling you something and you have not been listening, hit that subscribe button. This channel is built for you. Drop a comment and tell me which broth your grandmother used to make. I want to hear those stories before they disappear. Number 7. Oxtail broth. This is the one I mentioned at the beginning. The one made from a part of the animal that most people today do not even know is edible. Oxtail was considered garbage. The tail of the cow, bony, full of cartilage, tough as rope, and worth almost nothing at the market. Butchers would throw it in with an order as a favor. The way you toss in an extra roll at a bakery. Here, take these too. Nobody else wants them. But the women who accepted those tails knew something the rest of the market did not. Oxtail, simmered low for 5 or 6 hours, produced a broth unlike anything else in the kitchen. The cartilage between each vertebra melted slowly, releasing something thick and silky into the water. The narrow bones gave up their marrow. The connective tissue dissolved. What remained was a broth so rich it was closer to gravy than soup. Dark, glossy, and heavy with the kind of deep nourishment that no quick stock could ever replicate. Families in the industrial cities during the 30s made this when the cold months brought a particular kind of stiffness, the kind that lived in the hips, the lower back, the places where the body carried its heaviest loads. A bowl of oxtail broth in the morning, and the body moved a little easier. Not perfectly, not like youth, but easier. And for someone whose livelihood depended on being able to stand up and work, easier was enough. The irony is bitter. Oxtail, which was once worthless, literally given away, now costs more per pound than most cuts of beef. The world eventually caught on, but the people who needed it most could no longer afford it. The economics reversed and the knowledge went with them. Number 6. Turkey carcass broth. Once a year, every kitchen that could afford it had a whole turkey. And once a year, the morning after, the carcass sat on the counter like a question. What now? Most families threw it away. The ones who understood bones did not. The carcass went into the biggest pot in the kitchen. Broken apart with bare hands if necessary, the ribs snapped. The spine cracked to expose what was inside. Cold water, an onion, a handful of celery leaves, not the stalks, the leaves, because they had more flavor and nobody used them for anything else. Then the stove did its work for the rest of the day. Turkey broth had a particular quality that set it apart from chicken or beef. It was lighter, more delicate, but with a depth that surprised you. The dark meat still clinging to the carcass gave it body. The broken bones released their contents slowly, and the cartilage along the spine, the part most people never noticed, dissolved into something that thickened the broth naturally, without flour, without starch, without anything except time. Grandmothers served this broth every day for the week after the holiday, plain, in a cup, before any meal. They said it settled the body after all that heavy eating. But what they were really doing, without naming it, without explaining it, was filling the house with something warm during the coldest week of the year, and making sure nobody's body seized up when the temperature dropped below freezing. The carcass that cost nothing produced a week of broth. The arithmetic of that, one free leftover feeding a family for 7 days, was the kind of math that kept households running when nothing else added up. Number 5. Lamb shank broth. In neighborhoods where families from the old world had settled, the row houses, the walk-ups, the crowded blocks where 5 languages were spoken on a single street, lamb was not a luxury. It was what the butcher had. And the shank, the lower leg bone with its thick layer of connective tissue, and its stubborn meat that refused to be tender without hours of persuasion, was the cheapest part. 2 lamb shanks in a pot, a head of garlic, unpeeled, cut in half, crosswise, enough water to cover, and then the instruction that every mother gave without variation: leave it alone. 4 hours later, the meat had surrendered completely, falling off the bone in soft threads. The bone itself had given up its marrow, and the connective tissue, that tough, rubbery layer that made the shank seem like more trouble than it was worth, had dissolved into the broth, turning it into something that coated the inside of your mouth the way warm oil coats a cold engine. The old women in those neighborhoods did not drink this broth casually. They treated it with a kind of reverence. It was the broth you made in deep winter when the body felt brittle, when the mornings were so stiff you had to talk yourself into standing. A cup of lamb shank broth with a piece of bread torn into it was not breakfast. It was preparation. It was the body's way of being reminded that warmth still existed, that movement was still possible, that the cold had not won. Those neighborhoods have changed. The languages are different now, the butchers are gone. But somewhere in a kitchen that still smells like garlic and simmered bone, someone is making this. And they learned it the same way everyone did, not from a book, but from standing next to the person who made it before them. Now stop for a moment. There is a reason these broths disappeared, and it is not because they stopped working. It is because they take time, real time, not microwave time, not 30-minute meal time, 5, 6, 8 hours of a pot on a low flame, doing nothing visible, producing nothing dramatic, just sitting there while the rest of the world demands speed and efficiency and instant results. The generation that made these broths did not see that time as wasted. They saw it as the point. The slow extraction was not a flaw in the recipe. It was the recipe. You cannot rush a bone into giving up what it holds. You can only wait. And in the waiting, something happens that no shortcut can replicate. We lost these broths the same way we lost everything else that required patience. Not because we found something better, but because we found something faster. And faster is not the same as better. It has never been the same. If you are still watching, And the fact that you are tells me something about you. Leave a like. It takes a second. It helps this reach the people who need it. And the next 4 broths on this list are the ones that carry the most weight. Stay with me. Number 4, chicken foot broth. This is the one that makes people uncomfortable. And that discomfort is exactly the reason it needs to be here. Chicken feet. Yellow, scaly, clawed, and deeply unappealing to anyone who did not grow up watching their grandmother drop a fistful of them into a boiling pot without a second thought. Most grocery stores do not even sell them. Most butchers toss them. Most people alive today have never seen one used in cooking. But the women who made this broth, who had to make this broth because there was nothing else, knew that chicken feet contained more of the substance that made broth thick and rich than any other part of the bird. More than the carcass, more than the back, more than the neck. Foot by foot, they were the most concentrated source of what bones had to give. You cleaned them first, scalded them in boiling water to peel the outer skin, clipped the nails, then into the pot with cold water, a splash of vinegar, and thyme. 3 to 4 hours minimum. The feet collapsed slowly, the cartilage dissolving, the tiny bones softening, until what remained in the pot looked almost alarming. A broth so thick it barely moved when you tilted the pot. When it cooled, it was not liquid. It was solid. A trembling golden jelly that you had to reheat before you could drink it. In communities across the rural stretches of this land, that jelly was considered the most powerful thing a kitchen could produce. Grandmothers gave it to anyone whose body was stiff, whose joints would not cooperate, whose morning started with pain instead of purpose. They did not explain why it worked. They did not need to. The proof was in the person who drank it Monday and moved better by Thursday. The cost was 0. The feet were free on a waste product turned into the richest broth in the kitchen. That transformation from garbage to nourishment was the quiet genius of an entire generation. And we threw it away because it looked ugly. Number 3, beef knuckle and joint broth. This is the broth from the opening of this video. The one that the woman in the coal hills drank every morning. Beef knuckles are the joint bones. The rounded ends where one bone meets another. They are covered in cartilage, wrapped in connective tissue, and filled with a dense, spongy marrow that is darker and richer than the marrow found in straight shank bones. They are, quite literally, the joints of the animal, and the women who made this broth believed, with the unshakable certainty of lived experience, that drinking the joints of the animal helped the joints of the person. The preparation was the slowest on this list. 12 hours was not unusual. Some women started the pot at night and let it simmer through until morning, the kitchen warm while the rest of the house slept cold. The knuckles were large, dense, and stubborn. They did not give up their contents easily, but when they finally did around hour 8 or 9, the broth underwent a transformation. It went from thin and pale to dark and gelatinous, almost syrupy, with a depth of flavor that was not really flavor at all. It was substance. It was the feeling of drinking something that had weight and purpose and arrived in the body like reinforcement. No one measured, no one timed. The test was always the same. Dip a spoon into the broth, let it cool on the back of your hand, and if it clings and does not run, it is ready. If it drips like water, the bones have more to give. Put the lid back on. Walk away. Come back later. That woman in the coal hills was not unique. Thousands of women in hundreds of communities across the breadth of this land did the same thing, at the same hour for the same reason. The cold had settled into their bones, and the only thing that pulled it back out was the slow, patient surrender of another set of bones in a pot of quiet water. Number 2, the ham hock and vinegar broth. Most people know ham hock as a flavoring for beans. A smoky accent dropped into a pot of pintos or black-eyed peas and fished out when the cooking was done. But before it became a seasoning, it was the main event. A ham hock is a joint, the ankle of the pig. It is wrapped in skin, layered with thick connective tissue, packed with cartilage, and crowned with a small, dense bone that holds concentrated marrow. It is, in essence, a self-contained broth kit. Everything you need is in one piece. The women who made this broth added something that most other broths did not include: a generous splash of apple cider vinegar. Not for flavor. The vinegar was functional. It pulled from the bones what plain water alone could not reach. It softened the cartilage faster. It broke down the connective tissue more completely. And it gave the finished broth a brightness that cut through the richness and made it easier to drink first thing in the morning on an empty stomach. 2 ham hocks, a tablespoon of vinegar, water, salt, 4 hours on a low simmer, and the kitchen smelled like smoke and warmth and something ancient. A smell that sat in the walls for days and greeted you every time you walked through the door. The hock meat, falling apart and tender, was eaten with bread. The broth was strained, stored in jars, and reheated cup by cup over the following days. Nothing was wasted. The skin, which had turned soft and gelatinous, was sometimes chopped and stirred back into the broth for added richness. Every part served a purpose. Every part had a destination. That was not frugality. That was respect. For the animal, for the food, for the effort of staying alive. Before we reach number 1, I want to say something directly. If you have watched this far, you are not here by accident. Something about this resonated. Maybe it is a memory. Maybe it is a feeling in your own body that you have been ignoring. Maybe it is the quiet recognition that the generation before us knew things we have forgotten, and the forgetting has cost us something real. These broths are not magic. They are not miracles. They are food. Simple, slow, ancient food made from parts of the animal that the modern world considers worthless. But the women who made them, who stood at their stoves in cold kitchens with aching hands and tired backs, did not consider them worthless. They considered them essential, and they were right. Make one of these this week, any of them. You do not need a recipe. You need bones, water, time, and the willingness to believe that something that simple can matter. Because it can. It always could. Subscribe if you have not. Share this with someone who needs it, and tell me in the comments. Which broth did your grandmother make? What did she call it? What did she say when she handed you the cup? I want those stories before they are gone. Number 1. The everything pot. This had no name. It never had a name. Every family called it something different or called it nothing at all. It was simply the pot that never emptied. Here is how it worked. A large pot stayed on the back of the stove. Every bone from every meal went into it. Chicken bones from Sunday, pork rib bones from Tuesday, a beef shank end from Thursday. Vegetable scraps, onion skins, celery ends, carrot tops went in too. Water was added as the level dropped. The pot simmered on the lowest heat the stove could hold, and it was never fully emptied. Every day you ladled out what you needed. Every day new bones and scraps went back in. The broth that came from this pot was unlike anything else on this list. It was layered, chicken and beef and pork and vegetable, all mingling together in a liquid that changed slightly every day as new ingredients joined and old ones dissolved into nothing. Monday's broth tasted different from Wednesday's, which tasted different from Saturday's. But all of it was rich, all of it was thick, and all of it carried the accumulated nourishment of every bone that had entered that pot for weeks at a time. This was called perpetual broth, and during the hardest years it was the beating heart of the kitchen. It was always there, always ready, always warm. And when someone came home cold, there was broth. When someone woke up stiff, there was broth. When there was nothing else to eat, there was broth. It asked for nothing except bones that would have been thrown away and water that cost nothing. A woman who raised 4 children alone during the hardest decade this land has known kept an everything pot going on her stove from the fall of 1931 to the spring of 1938. 7 years. She said she never turned it off except to clean it once a month. She said her children never missed a day of school to illness. She said the pot was the last thing she checked before bed and the first thing she checked when she woke up. When her youngest daughter asked decades later what the secret was, the old woman did not talk about ingredients or technique or method. She said, "I just never let it go empty." That is the whole lesson, not just for broth, for everything. Never let it go empty. Keep adding, keep simmering. Keep ladling out what is needed and putting back what you have. The pot does not care if the bones are fancy or cheap, if the vegetables are fresh or half spent. It takes what you give it and turns it into something that keeps people standing. That is what this entire list has been about. Not bone broth as a trend. Not bone broth as a product. Bone broth as an act. The act of taking what the world considers worthless, the scraps, the joints, the cast-offs, the parts nobody wants, and turning them slowly, patiently, through nothing more than heat and time, into the thing that keeps a family alive. These 10 broths are older than any cookbook, older than any kitchen gadget, older than the idea that food needs to be complicated to be powerful. They come from a time when people understood that the body knows what it needs, and what it needs is simple: warmth, nourishment, patience, and the quiet proof that someone cared enough to keep a pot on the stove. Make one. Tonight. Tomorrow morning. Whenever the cold settles in and the body reminds you that it is tired and it needs something and you are not sure what that something is. It is broth. It was always broth. Save the bones, fill the pot, turn the flame low, and wait. That is the wisdom. That is the whole thing. Do not let it disappear.